Hello, everybody. I'm Mike Montgomery, the Executive Director of CALInnovates, and I want to thank everybody for coming today. It's always nice to throw a party and have people show up, so thank you. For those of you who don't know, CALInnovates is a San Francisco-based tech advocacy group. We're focused on a variety of issues, both in the state of California and in Washington, D.C., from ride-sharing and home sharing to music streaming and copyright, set-top boxes, and privacy, which is why we're here today. We work with a variety of companies, from small startups that you haven't heard of to major corporations that you have, and everything in between. The privacy debate is obviously very critical and extremely timely. In fact, I think we're going to have some more people show up here in a moment when the FTC oversight hearing ends, I hope. Let's see. So a few things. I'm kind of an optimist. I think there may be a melting of this ideological gridlock that we're seeing in Congress. Congress is now a little bit more emboldened, as we've seen on the set-top box proceeding. And I guess we'll see what happens with that soap opera as it comes to its initial conclusion later this week. But each issue before us presents the opportunity to take a deeper look and perhaps evolve our perspective. And so now is the right time to talk about privacy. Now is the right time to ask some harder questions about the privacy debate, especially because we're on the cusp of a new administration. And so some have said that the FCC is acting at the will of the people and finally taking action and putting ISPs in the rightful place. That's what some people say. Others would argue that the FCC is regulating via slogans and talking points that unfairly tilt the field toward clear winners and losers, and that the market should actually decide. So, do we need diverse standards or generic rules of uniform applicability? It's a great question, and I wish Chairman Wheeler could be here. Unfortunately, it looks like he can't be, but wouldn't it be great if he were, because then we could have quite a debate with John Leibowitz and the chairman. But luckily, we have Harold Feld here, who some people tout as the chairman of the shadow FCC. And then we have Richard Bennett sitting right next to him, who who some people believe is standing outside of Harold's glass house, holding a big sack of stones and occasionally breaking windows. So I know I'm here today because I'm excited to see what sort of drama will unfold between these two right here. But before we get there to this privacy cage match, let's talk about John Leibowitz, who we're very excited to have. He's an expert at straddling competition policy, privacy, and consumer protection. And as he's said many times before, these issues both intersect and overflow. And that makes it really hard for policymakers to craft an appropriate solution. John tells us we can't accept silo thinking in this dynamic marketplace. So I'm excited to hear what he has to say, but we have to remain vigilant to privacy concerns and maintaining or even strengthening these standards in the midst of the radical change that's happening in our economy. And so John Leibowitz has been there. He's seen all the angles, and I think he's got a vision for what should happen in terms of privacy for the next 10 years and beyond. No matter where you stand, if you're on one side or the other, I think everyone can benefit from John's thinking. So, for those who don't know, John served in House Judiciary and Senate Judiciary, and because of his efforts, he brought back a true oversight role in Congress for antitrust and competition policy. He, of course, was the chairman of the FTC. And with that, two quick notes. We have in the back of the room Duck Donuts for people who are interested and like donuts. And we have candy from Cameron's, which is a program that employs, that's called Everyone Can Work. that employs people with intellectual disabilities, and it's very good. So on your way out, please grab some. With that, I give you the maestro of public policy, John Leibowitz.
Thank you, Mike, for that kind and entirely undeserved introduction. And I do want to say one thing about Chairman Wheeler. By the way, I guess we're not. I see that there's a camera here, so I guess we are not on Chatham House rules, which is okay. Do we have any reporters here? In which case, I will temper. That's fine. Okay, fine. In which case, I will temper or modify or maybe even expand my remarks accordingly. And I think it's great that you have so many people here. I see sort of a broad group of Hill staffers and advocates and a few of my clients, and you have a terrific panel here today. Really, it'll be. I don't think it's a cage match at all. I think it's really just a sort of a discussion, more than that, just really about ideas. And, you know, reasonable people can disagree, and I have great confidence, just going back to Chairman Wheeler, I have great confidence that, you know, when you write a rule, you often put it out in one form, but it improves with time because you listen and talk to stakeholders, and I have some optimism, some optimism that that's what will happen here. I should point out that while I'm going to try to sort of mostly set the stage, I am a co-chair with Mary Bono of the 21st Century Privacy Coalition. It's a group of internet service providers that believe in privacy and have sort of come, I would say, over the last few years have sort of evolved to the point of I would say a support. Maybe some of them were supportive even when we wrote our 2012, that is the FTC wrote its 2012 privacy report. But for the approach of the FTC, which more or less tries to to try to ensure that there's an even playing field, but also that privacy of consumers is really protected, and I'll talk about that a little more. Aside from the phenomenal group of panelists today, there's one other person I do want to mention. It's John Urowski, who is who's standing in the back with Malika Carroll. And John, who I'm also very fond of, but John is really about the best combination of advocate, a public policy advocate, and antitrust lawyer, and then beyond that, jack of all trades too. That I know he's really been and like many people in Washington, like some people in Washington, because he has always been a straight shooter. You know, he is actually has friends on both sides of the aisle, and so I was very fortunate to work with him, and I'm glad he is here today. Although I'm a little nervous because he's listening to what I have to say, but that's okay. It's great. So I think it's a great title that you have here: Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Privacy. And really, in America, privacy protection begins with Justice. Well, before he was even Justice, with Louis Brandeis, who wrote a seminal law review article in 1890 called "The Right to Privacy." He was very, very concerned about the toxic combination of cameras and tabloid journalism and peeping toms, and he called for a legal regime that's 26 years ago, to protect the privacy of all Americans in commercial endeavors. And he was also the one of the founding fathers of the Federal Trade Commission, where I was fortunate enough to work. So really, to some extent, the tradition of consumer privacy protection in the United States begins with Louis Brandeis, and when he came to the court, he began to write about privacy. Now, often it was a right to privacy that involved the government's ability to intrude on Americans, but it also spoke to the commercial to commercial privacy as well. And in a case in 1928 called Olmsted v. the United States, he wrote, by the way, it was in dissent, but I don't like to say that because like 40 years later, his dissent was adopted. And he wrote that, and I quote, "The right to be let alone is the most comprehensive of rights and the right most valued by civilized men." And I think that still is a sentiment that many of us agree with, today. So while Justice Brandeis's concerns about newspapers may seem quaint now in an era of big data with omnipresent smartphones and computers and connected devices, Rudy, I'm going to quiz you later on this, and connected devices involving the sharing of information and, cyberazzi that collect information on from consumers' computers by putting cookies on it without necessarily with their consent. The right to privacy, I think we all know, extends beyond protection to unwanted government intrusion, but also it's it's also a critically important way in which we think about how we interact with businesses and companies who provide enormous benefits, but also, whose benefits sometimes do raise legitimate privacy concerns. So, part one, Brandeis, father of privacy. We're finished with that. Now we'll start to talk about the FTC, and then I'll turn to the FCC and the FCC rule in a little bit. So, during my time at the Commission, and for those of you who don't know the FTC, and Malika and I were just talking about this earlier, it is a truly bipartisan agency where people literally sit around and try to come up with the best answers. It doesn't mean people don't disagree, but when they did, it was rare, and when they did, it wasn't necessarily party-driven. It was more often just driven by different ways and different approaches and different ways that commissioners would think about issues. So when I was at the FTC, and I think this continues to today, we always tried to be mindful of the tremendous advances that the descendants of Justice Brandeis's mechanical devices and cameras have brought to our economy, because big data really does provide very, very significant benefits. But we also embraced, and I'm saying we even though it's they now, but it was we when I was there. But the Commission also embraced its role as the chief privacy agency in the United States, and tried to craft a balanced approach that protected privacy, and sought to ensure that privacy was protected, but at the same time technological innovation was promoted. And so the Commission tried to do this really in two ways. It will occasionally do rulemakings. So the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act is a privacy rulemaking because that involves vulnerable population, kids 12 and under, and takes an opt-in approach. But for the most part, the principal tools of the FTC are enforcement, because it's an enforcement agency first, and policy. And it thinks of itself as a policy agency second. And we use those two tools to try to protect consumer privacy and ensure data security when I was there. So, how does the FTC enforce privacy protection? For the most part, it does it using its authority under Section 5 of the FTC Act, which prohibits unfair, deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce. And in other words, it uses that very broad, very flexible statute to hold companies accountable when they make misrepresentations about their privacy protections or place customers in jeopardy of real harm. And all told, if you include not only Section 5, unfair, deceptive acts or practices, but also enforcement of the do not call rule, which has been a rule that Dave Barry called the most successful government program since the Elvis stamp. I thought that was a funnier joke, actually, than the laughter we got, but fine, I'm leaving now. No, I'm just not going to make more jokes. If you include Do Not Call, Right to Financial Privacy Act, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, but particularly the sanctions against unfair, deceptive acts or practices The FTC has probably brought more than 500 privacy cases over the last 35 years, and more than 100 data security cases. I'm sorry, more than 50 data security cases since the beginning of the millennium, since 2000. And that's really important because it sends signals to companies that if you say, I'm going to protect this data, I'm not going to sell this data, you have to honor your commitment. And most companies do, by the way. And it sends signals, and it also ensures that general counsels and companies that care about privacy sort of look at the guidance and look at the case law, and make sure that they are doing the right things. So enforcement is the first and most important prong at the FTC, but the second prong is policy, and we care, and particularly because the FTC has very limited rulemaking authority. Its rulemaking authority is typically under the Magnuson-Moss Act, not regular notice and comment rulemaking. And the Magnuson-Moss Act is like a medieval form of rulemaking. It's designed to ensure that the agency really can't do rules, and I don't think it started a new Mag-Moss rule since 1979. And I can assure you that one was not finished because it was banning advertising on children's television. And so, particularly because of the lack of rulemaking authority, policy is enormously important, and teaching companies about best practices, I think, is also important. And so, in 2012, we put out the FTC put out a major report called "Protecting Consumer Privacy in an Era of Rapid Change: Recommendations for Businesses and Policymakers." It is known as the Privacy Report, and it was and it took us 2+ years to write. We put out multiple drafts. We had multiple. We put out 2 drafts. We had multiple workshops on the issue. We received over 400 substantive and different comments. So sometimes, an agency doing a rulemaking gets 50,000 comments, or in the case of the FCC on Title II regulation, probably, what is it, Rudy? Hundreds of thousands of comments, millions of comments, but they're all pretty much the same. 400 different substantive comments, all of which were sort of stress tested and reviewed by the agency. And we came up with 3 policies that we thought were really important. 1, privacy by design. 2, transparency, and 3, consumer choice. Privacy by design is sort of what you think it might be. It means when you're designing this cool new app, you need to also, and I know Mike's companies know this, you need to bake in the privacy protections as well. Otherwise, consumers often will not be protected. Transparency is more transparency, so consumers know what they're doing. And the third part is consumer choice and control. And with regard to consumer choice, the FTC recognized that context matters. Consumer expectations turn on the type of data, and how that data is being used. And so consumer privacy should be crafted with consumer expectations in mind. So the approach of the FTC was grounded in the distinction, I think, between sensitive data like medical and financial records, information about vulnerable populations like kids, and non-sensitive data. And I think the FTC approach was to distinguish these and to make sure that when you're dealing with sensitive data, the approach should be an opt-in approach. Non-sensitive data, routine information, it should be something less than that. And we also spent a special amount of time, because the issues are complex, looking at large platform providers. So large platform providers could be ISPs and broadband providers, or they could be sort of the Facebooks, the Googles of the world, because actually they all end up collecting very similar, if not identical, types of information. And the Commission thought that the rules, to the extent possible or practicable, or the best practices, should be the same across the board. Interestingly, the 2012 report was initially criticized by some in industry as unnecessary, and it simultaneously heralded who is a terrific advocate, received some praise, actually more than some praise, from consumer advocacy groups. And since then, I think there's been sort of generally broad support for its principles and for the and for the report itself. Is that fair?
We're talking about the 2012. Yeah.
Tim, is that fair?
Didn't agree with everything in it, but you know.
Tim is now working on the business side of this, so he still remains critical.
That's not true. I've got clients. There are a lot of advocacy clients, and we can talk about it later.
Just joking. I'm sorry. Okay.
You did a good job with the statute you have.
But, you know, when I came to the commission in 2000, the FTC in 2004, late 2004, the only agency, with the possible exception of Justice, the Justice Department that had a cyber crimes unit, the only agency that really cared about consumer privacy and data security was the FTC. And as we sort of look at, you know, as we sort of open the newspapers and learn about all the potential data breaches, whether they are by, you know, activist hackers or people who are criminals or by, you know, or nation sponsored, you look at Target, Sony, you know, Yahoo, OMB. You know, consumer privacy and cybersecurity have really taken center stage in Washington. There was a question last night on it in the debate, and it is drawing near daily attention, I would say, from other agencies. So we've seen the SEC start to bring cases. Justice Department has been much more involved. Jim Comey had a quote that said something like there are only two kinds of companies, the head of the FBI, two kinds of companies, ones that have been hacked by the Chinese and know about it, and ones that have been hacked by the Chinese and don't yet know about it. That's not me. Others have said, some people think, let me wave my arm like this. And apparently that was not a very good imitation of one of the presidential candidates. But anyway, and the FTC has begun to prioritize privacy as well. And so when the FCC decided to do Title II net neutrality, its Title II open internet order, using Title II, it took away jurisdiction from the Federal Trade Commission, which has had oversight over pretty much all of the entire economy for privacy issues, but not common carriers. And the Title II reclassification reclassified ISPs as common carriers, taking away jurisdiction from the Federal Trade Commission, which has no jurisdiction over common carriers. That goes back to when the FTC was created in 1914 and came out of the Bureau, came out of the Commerce Department. It only had jurisdiction over for-profit companies, and so that's never been over the objection of bipartisan members of Congress and bipartisan FTC and unanimous FTC commissions. That has never been changed, or it hasn't been changed yet. Perhaps someday the common carrier exemption will be lifted, but now it exists. And so it lost jurisdiction, and it made sense, I think it does make sense, for an agency that really hadn't done a lot of privacy protection, particularly from an enforcement side, but hadn't been all that engaged in privacy issues, to do a sort of rethink or a thinking about how they wanted to handle privacy. They have all this jurisdiction. They have new responsibilities. There would otherwise be a potentially significant law enforcement gap where if you didn't have the FCC asserting some control or being the cop on the beat because the FTC couldn't do it anymore. And this, it's been sort of interesting. I'm going to try not to characterize it too much, but I think that the FCC rulemaking has become a little bit of a battle for the hearts of the hearts and minds over the appropriate approach to privacy regulation. You know, as drafted, the proposed rule presents a contrast. I'm not so sure it's a stark one, but a contrast with the principles set out in the FTC's 2012 report. Again, to paraphrase Donald Trump, I'm not saying that, but some people would say, and lots of people think, that there's a stark contrast or at least some contrast. Now, while the FTC approach narrowly tailors opt-in requirements to sensitive data that consumers care most about, the FTC, at least in its draft, NPRM, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, imposes a sort of broad opt-in requirement on the use of data with only very limited exceptions. So, for example, under the proposed FCC rule, an ISP couldn't offer to its subscribers, say, discount home security package in the same way. It could with an opt-in, but prior to the advertisement itself or an opt-in. But it couldn't in the same way that, say, Amazon can offer you a suggested book. If you've read one book, you might be interested in this other one. Or Netflix can suggest, movies or television shows to you. And they do it all the time, and consumers consider that to be routine first-party interaction. So maybe a different way to put it is that the FCC rule, as some of you may know, it has a default that's an opt-in, even for certain types of routine first-party information. And the FTC approach, if it were grafted onto FTC rules, would be an opt-in for sensitive information and perhaps the content of web browsing. Anyway, in the world of privacy, there is a disagreement, and as you'll hear later from this panel, that's not terribly unusual to have disagreements on privacy. Privacy is a really important issue, and reasonable people can disagree, and probably better outcomes are delivered to consumers out of, after there's a lot of discussion, interaction, and thinking about things. But it's unusual in Washington to have one agency, the FTC, one agency disagree with another. And here, the rulemaking seems to sort of pit the FTC approach and perhaps the White House approach, because in 2012, the White House called for only one agency to regulate privacy across the entire economy, and that was the FTC. So the FTC and maybe the White House on one side and the FCC, at least based on its proposed rulemaking, maybe not on the basis of its final rulemaking, on the other. And the FTC comment was very diplomatic, because it should be. But it was very clear that it was very clear that the FTC had some fundamental differences with the approach that the FCC had taken. And again, I worked at the FTC for 8.5 years. It's a terrific agency. They thought a lot about privacy, but and so I tend to, and I was part of the group that wrote the 2012 report. So I obviously am partisan in that way, or perhaps not entirely objective. But I do think that the FTC, I would just say this, I do think the FTC approach is a very thoughtful one. And one of the ways in which agencies, again, one of the ways in which agencies become better at enforcing the law is by talking amongst each other. And this comment, I think, was very meaningful. Now, it is impossible, I think, to say with certainty where the FCC will come out. There may be some indications. We've heard that it will make revisions and base its final rule on a sensitive, non-sensitive framework, so more like the FTC approach. Some would say, a lot of people think, don't I need to, apparently another bad joke. Anyway, some would say a lot of people think, Harold may disagree, and I won't speak for him because he's very articulate and he very articulately speaks for himself. But that the FTC approach would ensure, grafted onto the FCC rule, or as extended to the FTC rule, would say that would be an approach that both protects consumer privacy, because we don't want sensitive data and data that is inconsistent with routine interactions collected without our consent, but at the same time would allow the kind of innovations and benefits to consumers that would be helpful. But whatever I would say the final rule looks like, there are sort of 2 or 3 things that you should be thinking about. So the first thing is, and I've talked about this earlier, the FTC cannot replicate whatever the FCC rule will be, because the FTC has this medieval form of rulemaking called the Magnuson-Moss Act. When I was at the FTC, a bipartisan group of might have been unanimous, but it was certainly bipartisan of FTC commissioners supported some eased rulemaking for the commission that passed the House. It did not pass the Senate, and so the percentage, and I think it's a fairly small percentage, of internet advertising that will be covered by the FCC rule will apply only to ISPs. You can't regulate. That for the rest of the economy. So that's thing one. Thing two, the implications of the rule, I think, are critical to Silicon Valley and edge providers, because whatever the FCC comes up with, my guess is that members of Congress, and privacy is a bipartisan issue, but I think mostly on the Democratic side this will be true, will call for an even playing field lifted up so that not just internet service providers, but also edge providers and other technology companies will be under the same rules, and there'll be an even playing field. But it won't be the unfair, deceptive act or practices approach of the FTC. It'll be the FCC rule as a baseline. And the third point, I think, especially given the rise of big data, its benefits, its perils. Someone once said that technology is a peculiar thing. It gives you great benefits with one hand, and it does, and it can stab you in the back with the other. But especially given the enormous collection of big data, which has benefits for consumers, also raises some potential issues. There's no doubt in my mind that there should be more and continued discussion about the FCC rule, and you'll have that right after I quit bloviating, and also that the words of Justice Brandeis, privacy, the right to be let alone, the most comprehensive of rights, and the right most valued by civilized men are at least as important today as when he wrote it in 1928. So with that, let me quit bloviating, but I'll take a couple questions if you want, and then I'll turn it over to much more learned people. Yes, go ahead. Fawn.
I will exercise my right as moderator to ask you a question. You are, I think, admit in your statements that you are an FTC partisan. Is that fair?
Partisan?
Meaning that
I am, but I also, yes, I am an FTC. I worked at the FTC. Mm-hmm. I love the agency. I think that its thinking on privacy is very evolved, thoughtful, balanced, and privacy protecting. But yes, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I'm walking away from that.
All right. So before my first question to Harold will be after we're done here. But can you just? I mean, you've given a whole set of the history of how this happened at the FTC. But is there any particular reason why? Are there any limitations in the FTC's power to regulate privacy that might cause some, maybe not you, but others, pause?
You mean if they did regulate privacy?
Are there any limitations to what the FTC can do?
Sure. So the FTC rulemaking authority is twofold. When Congress passes a law and the FTC wants rules, wants to be able to implement rules, we go to Congress and we say, give us APA. It's called notice and comment rulemaking. It means you put out a draft, you take comments, you put out a final rule. And Congress will often give that to us, or give that to the FTC. But the FTC also, when it uses its organic consumer protection authority to draft rules, is under Magnuson-Moss, and Magnuson-Moss makes it very, very difficult to do rules. There's a reason why Congress placed that. I call it medieval, and the commissioners, both sides of the aisle, used to make fun of it. But there's a reason why Congress did that, and it's because if you are an agency like the FTC that covers the entire economy, maybe some people think that you don't have the expertise in a specific vertical or a specific area to be given very far-reaching rulemaking authority. So that's the basis for a limited rulemaking authority under Mag-Moss. I think most people would say it is probably too limited now, but maybe APA rulemaking goes too far. Does that answer your question? All right, and any questions from the non-panel audience? All right. Well, with that, thank you for listening to me, and good luck with your day in Washington.
Well, I want to thank Mr. Leibowitz for enduring my reporter question. Let me introduce myself. For those of you who don't know, I'm Fawn Johnson. I am the policy editor at Counsel, which is a polling and policy editorial organization, and I have covered this stuff for a while. So we have a set of panelists here who I think that our main purpose is to talk about the FCC's proposed rule on privacy and ISPs. We have, I think, in Harold, who is the Senior Vice President of Public Knowledge, the defender of the FCC's efforts here. We have in Richard Bennett, who is the founder of High Tech Forum and a publisher, a person who is, I would say, a critic of the rule in general. And then immediately next to me, we have Tim Sparapani, who is the one who's going to throw the monkey wrench in the entire debate. So with that said, I think given that we've heard a long explanation of what the FTC has been doing on privacy, I would like Harold to open it up and just tell us why the FCC is an appropriate regulator in this space, given that the only place that they actually have authority is over the internet service provider and not the edge providers.
Well, yeah, and just to use Chairman Leibowitz's last comment as a good jumping off point. So, yes, one of the things that has happened with regard to the FTC since its beginning, when not just the common carrier exception, but also the banking exception, the meat packers exception, although that came later, insurance exceptions, although that came later, but a number of other specialized areas. HIPAA is another one, but there is a belief that has been around the FTC's authority since its inception that certain sectors of the economy are specialized and require specialized agencies, some working in concert with the FTC, some having more exclusive jurisdictions, as I described in a 70-page white paper which gives you more about the jurisdictional issues than you will ever want to know. This can be summarized as sort of a general hub and spoke theory. You have the FTC as the general consumer protector, and again, its privacy jurisdiction is not unique privacy jurisdiction. It is general consumer protection, which in the 1990s, the FTC properly recognized started to include privacy issues. But again, it's not a specialized privacy agency. It's a specialized it's a general purpose consumer protection agency. And there are all these little spokes that go off around it to agencies like the Food and Drug Administration, the HHS for HIPAA, a number of the financial regulators, all of these, and this is how the FTC has worked for the last 100 years. That includes the area of communications. We have always, since the first Mail Act 225 years ago, have treated our communications as one of those things that requires special attention, both in terms of making sure everybody can use it and recognizing its essential character, which is why we actually have in the Constitution that Congress can create postal roads. But we have also recognized that for business to be conducted with the appropriate level of confidence in the confidentiality of the information, for people to be able to communicate with each other, that the communications network, whether it is the post office or the telephone system or now into the internet, must be especially secure. So just as we had regulations about mail carriers that even though if I put a package on my front doorstep, anybody walking by can look at the address label and can say, okay, yeah, that's I can copy the address that you're sending that package to because you've put it out there and I can see it. The mail carrier is not allowed to keep a record of the address that I sent it to and to benefit from that because I must use a mail carrier to deliver a package. I must have some confidence that my package can be delivered in a secure and private manner. We extended that to telephone, section, 47 U.S.C. section 605, section 705 of the Communications Act, just because we like to confuse non-lawyers with this stuff, is, the first Privacy and Communications Act that is as old as the 1934 Communications Act itself. In fact, it even goes back further. It goes to back to the Federal Radio Act of 1927 for what were primitive two-way communications, which says if you're the provider of a communication service, you are not allowed to know what that communication is. You are not permitted to provide the information to anybody else. You're not supposed to provide the addressing information to anybody else. So there is a long history here unique to the unique nature of communication. The FCC now is looking at broadband communication as a network. It has, pursuant to the congressional direction, extended the jurisdiction to these communications networks. You may or may not like the Title II decision, but that is the law. The court has affirmed it. I'll also add that frankly it's a good thing because based on the Ninth Circuit's decision recently in the AT&T mobility case, if the FCC did not have unambiguous jurisdiction over this, we would all be screwed right now because the AT&T mobility case stands for the proposition that AT&T couldn't have its broadband offerings at all regulated by the FTC because it was a wireless carrier with licenses from the FCC and because it had one service, mobile voice, that was a telecommunications service. That status also shielded its information service broadband capacity. So what we have here is a place where Congress has told the FCC very explicitly not to do just general communications, not to do just general consumer protection here, but to very explicitly, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we want you to protect. And Congress actually lists, which it doesn't do in the FTC, a whole bunch of stuff that it says, this stuff is super important. We're calling it customer proprietary network information. So it's a different statute, a different regime, and is part of an overall scheme that we have in the country of having specialized agencies that look to particular services to complement the FTC's general jurisdiction.
Okay, so and communication is special. We get from Harold, but so I think the next place we need to talk about is what communication is versus data, which is where I want to bring Richard in because I asked people before this panel to describe how they feel about the FCC ISP rule, and he offered I could argue, perhaps a snarky response that says that it protects Silicon Valley ad revenue at the expense of any kind of innovation. But I think that the bigger point is that we're talking that it's about communication, the flow of information, and then it's about the data. So Richard, how do we get benefits out of the data, particularly big data, without exposing vulnerabilities of people and to our enemies?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing we have to do, and I approach this as a technologist. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not particularly concerned about like what category of the law particular behavior fits into. That's I expect that just as technology evolves, the law should evolve to keep up with the capabilities that technology provides to us. And we're not really living in the world anymore that where communication was telegrams that you wrote out on a piece of paper and took to the telegraph office, and where an operator had to actually rekey and to key your message into the network. I mean, This is actually still common in many parts of the world. I spent a lot of time in India in the 1970s, and that was the way you communicated, was you wrote out a message, sent it to the telegraph office, and people sent, birthday cards basically through the telegraph system. Now, in that system, you have a human operator that is reading every individual message. And if you're living in a small town, in particular, unless that operator is really constrained by some strict penalties, the opportunities for gossip and some reputation damage are really quite apparent. But we're not living in the 1880s world anymore, right, where we have human beings that are reading all of our messages and gossip, spreading gossip about us. We're living in a world of technology in which science and technology, the evolution in those fields is improving our quality of life, improving our longevity, improving our prospects for personal growth and development, as well as bringing us tremendous convenience and nice cat videos to look at. And it would be a shame if, in our zeal to constrain the behavior of particular firms with particular statuses that make us uncomfortable, we eliminate or curtail the opportunities for innovation that the abundance of digital information makes available. And fundamentally, I think the distinction between communications networks and, say, web services is a completely artificial distinction. Because if you understand how the web works in terms of financing, it's an advertising-funded activity for the most part. There's a little bit of subscription going on. Things like Netflix, obviously, are subscription-based, not ad-based. But most of it runs on advertising. And the advertising dollars are concentrated pretty much in two firms. 85% of the advertising revenue generated by the web is handled by Facebook and Google. And I don't have a source for that, but so that could be completely a Donald Trumpism. But other people have said that, and I believe that it intuitively sounds plausible. So the battle that the FCC is refereeing is a desire on the part of the internet service providers to gain some advertising revenue as well. And this will enable them to reduce their subscription costs and hopefully grow their subscriber counts, which are perfectly legitimate aims for that kind of a business to take place. But to say that they are uniquely positioned in the internet as far as their ability to access personal information is just technically false. I mean, that just does not hold water, because every piece of information that passes through an internet service provider goes somewhere. And the destination, either both the originator and the receiver of that information have access to that information. And in fact, with the prevalence of encryption, they have access to it in a much more readily accessible form. I mean, for the most part, you have to be the NSA to be able to make any sense out of the encrypted data, which is pretty much the bulk of what passes over the internet today.
So I think we're realizing that we have one agency that can only regulate a piece of where the data is going, and then we've got another agency that can only regulate with some constraints from Congress. And so the question I posed to Tim is, who can actually take care of us in the way that we need to protect whatever information that we think is necessary to protect?
It's a great question, Fawn. The answer is really nobody, and that's
I knew it.
That's bad for consumers, right? It's bad for business. We've made an absolute mess of this, and I think it doesn't matter what industry you're from or where you sit as a consumer, you have to kind of throw up your hands and go, really, this is the best we could come up with?
Where else have I heard that?
Yeah, right.
Watching last night.
Yeah, sure. Here's where we are. I think we should ask ourselves two really fundamental questions. Which regime, if we have to choose between two, is going to benefit consumers? And which regime makes sense? And I think the answer is probably the same either way you line it up. What regime is going to benefit consumers? Look, we all love these services. Even my most privacy protective friends, and I was at the ACLU leading the privacy effort there, so I won't take a privacy backseat to anybody, but even my most privacy protective friends love the things that are happening with their data, right? They love the tools and conveniences they're getting. So we have to ask which regime is going to continue to propel those things forward while providing us really meaningful privacy. And I do mean meaningful privacy as opposed to just sort of lip service to it. And then the second question is, which regime then actually makes sense? Right now, and for, decades, we have regulated privacy by industry, right? You're a telco, so the FCC gets this slice of privacy protection. You're a healthcare company, you go to this regulatory statute. You're everybody else, and the FCC gets this broad catch-all jurisdiction. But here's the reality. Every business out there is now a data company. They may be like Caterpillar, a farming equipment company, but they are a data farming equipment company. It could be that you're Sears and you're a retail company, but you're really a data company that happens to also sell goods as well as using data for customer good. And if you step back and think about what that means, the implication is that our structure, which continues to silo off regulatory privacy protection to one agency for this and another for that, doesn't make any sense. And then think one step further. Because the way that companies are combining and merging and changing, there is no such thing as a telecommunications company that's solely a telecommunications company. Verizon bought Yahoo, right? I mean, Google lays out fiber cable. These companies are becoming an amalgamation of multiple industries. So the structure that we've got just simply doesn't make sense. And I am deeply concerned as a consumer advocate and as an advocate for innovation that the FCC has only doubled down on this structure and made it worse, right? By somehow claiming that communications are different except for when they're not. And then at some point, our data gets passed back and forth, and the FCC's got this part, and the FTC's got that part. But what happens when Verizon gathers data and passes it to Yahoo, and Yahoo does something in the same company and then passes it back to Verizon? Where's the consumer benefit for that, right? Where's the protection, and how are any of us supposed to make sense of what our protections really are?
Harold, do you have an answer to that?
Well, yeah, I would say it's an amazing thing to me. Whenever I talk to people outside of Washington, D.C., I have never heard anyone say, I wish I had fewer people protecting my consumer rights. I wish that I had fewer privacy rights. I wish that I had to have adjudication rather than rules. Nobody ever says that to me. Instead, what I hear from actual people outside of Washington, D.C. is, why doesn't somebody do something about this? What do you mean I'm paying you a subscription fee and you also get to take all of my data? If it's my data and it's valuable, why the hell don't you pay me for it? Facebook pays me for it in the sense that they provide me with free services. People like to say, well, if you're using a free service, you are the product. Okay. The corollary to that is, but if I'm paying you, then why the hell do you get this gravy? Because it spurs innovation? Well, if it's that great at spurring innovation, freaking ask first, which is, again, kind of the other false dichotomy that we get out of this, is what the hell is so hard about asking? We managed to do that just fine when it was telephone and telephone services and all the kind of innovations that people wanted to do, like providing security systems or whatever. And Congress said, yeah, if you can get the customer to say sure, because you've made the case to the customer about this, then great, go to town, innovate, do the thing you want to do. I have a lot of apps on this thing, and every now and then they tell me things like, Waze must access your information in order to provide you quality service. Is that okay? And I say, okay, because I like having Waze, even though I know that the trade-off of knowing that there is a cop a mile up the road is that Google is snarking up more of this information for its purposes. But at least I made that trade, and Waze is something good that asked me for it. There are a bunch of apps on this that I've never heard of that said, you know, Sprint asks me, can we get your information so that we can provide you with geographic service stuff? And I say no, because they don't do a good job for me. So, well, I mean, they give me a nice telephone and I like that, but their other stuff is crap. The issue, therefore, is everybody here in DC says, well, it's just confusing for consumers. But the only people who are asking for this are the companies that are regulated. Because, frankly, I disagree with Richard, and I agree with John Leibowitz about what the impact of the FCC acting here is, which is if the FCC acts and finds that certain privacy practices are good for consumers, then yes, that will help to elevate privacy protection for everyone across these services. And if the concern is, well, Facebook and Google are essentially, you know, monopoly providers or duopoly providers of ad revenue, the way the two-sided market works, I say, great, let's examine that. You know, if we say platforms, like social media platforms, like Facebook, for example, are now essentially the same as news aggregators, and therefore we ought to be concerned about their role, let's look at that. But you don't address those very real issues in a race to the bottom that, you know, no consumer in the world is saying, please give me less so that you can send me more ads.
Actually, Richard, I think I was going to ask you this question because what I love listening to John Leibowitz of talking about the difference between sensitive and not sensitive data, and I'm thinking, what does that mean? What do consumers want? I mean, especially if the FTC is basing its entire rulemaking authority on this idea of consumer expectations, that seems to me that's a real risky benchmark to be going for. Do you have any thoughts on what they
Yeah, I mean, historically, people don't want anything to change until they realize that, their friend tells them about, you know, the wonderful things they can do with their iPhone, then they want it. And our first reaction to technological change is to get creeped out by it, right? I mean, we're creeped out that, you know, that Google's reading our emails that we send through Gmail. I testified at a congressional hearing on internet privacy in 2008, and that was one of the issues that came up. And even then, by the way, it was a battle between the carriers and the websites. But I think it's a matter that we certainly know there are things about the status quo of the internet today that we don't like. I mean, we're basically drowning in advertising. And, you know, if you ask people, are you more the right to be left alone, when John was talking about that, the thing that it made me think of is pop-up ads. Because, you know, everywhere you go, you have to, like, close a box before you can read, you know, the stuff that you went there for. And so the most annoying thing about the web to me is just the volume of advertising, most of it very poorly targeted. I mean, you know, I constantly have this experience when I search on Google for something I want to buy, and then I end up buying it, but I buy it from somebody that isn't reporting to Google that I bought it. I get ads from the actual store that sold it to me for like 2 weeks. So that's really violating the heck out of my right to be left alone. So I think so the answers you'll get from consumers, I mean, it depends on who you're asking. I think Harold is sort of in the same boat as Pauline Kael, who didn't understand how Nixon could have won the election because she didn't know anybody who voted for him. But it depends on what you asked. So if you ask consumers, would you like to have an internet experience where you saw half as many ads and the ads you saw were more interesting to you, I think they'd say yes.
Which would involve better use of data and
more data
and also a reading of the data, which I'm not sure is something that people are necessarily comfortable with. But do we want to squelch it, I guess is the question for him.
But part of the question here is, does this squelch it? Because again, there are two things here. One is, I will say, it's not just me. If you read the Pew surveys on consumer attitudes and privacy, if you read the NTIA most recent survey on whether people do or do not do transactions online because if they're worried about privacy, is not just who I know. There are folks who are actually studying this. But again, part of the issue here is people are making this out to be well, we're going to prohibit you from doing that, which is not what the rule says. The rule says, or the proposed rule says, some of these things, particularly when it's a question of sharing with third parties, which we've traditionally found threatens makes it harder for consumers to know what's going to happen to their information, then you want to ask permission first. If it's something that's internal to the ISP, where the ISP is going to offer a service on its own, is going to do this innovation thing, they don't even have to ask permission first. They just have to give you a right to opt out. And there are some things that, we just assume you want the ISP to do, and we don't even let you opt out on that. So, this argument about, we shouldn't squelch it, I'm like, what? Because a pop-up screen the first time you're using it saying, can we use your information for this, squelches innovation? You're so afraid that if consumers have a choice about this, that so many of them will say no, and you can't possibly make a case to them, that the notion of asking first scares the crap out of you?
So I'm curious about this dichotomy, Tim, of sensitive data and not sensitive data, and how you're supposed to treat it. I have to admit that I'm confused, and I'm, I've studied some of this stuff. I'm not I might not be the brightest bulb in the box, but I'm certainly not the dumbest. So how do we make sense of what the regulatory landscape that's been presented to us, where there's opt-in options for some data, there's opt-out for others, there's two different regulatory bodies that are coming at the same questions?
It's a turf war. Let's be honest. It's a turf war.
So how do we make sense of it, and what happens next?
Well, we don't, and that's the point. We really need a do-over. Consumers, I think, deserve a do-over, and here's why. This rule is not future-proofed. It's like halfway born. It kind of doesn't get to where it wants to get to. And as communication services continue to evolve and these kinds of companies begin to merge more and more across traditional, silos of industry, none of this is going to make any sense. We're going to be back here going, I don't know, let's just throw the whole thing out and start over. And that's what I'm advocating right now. Yeah. John Leibowitz is
throw the whole thing out and start over.
I really believe this is necessary.
Going back. How far?
Well, let's start with the sensitive insensitive dichotomy that's been built into the U.S. privacy scheme. It doesn't make one bit of sense anymore. It frankly never did. LaTanya Sweeney at Harvard, one of the smartest people out there on data, has been harping on this, and I have been converted to her cause for a long time. The fact of the matter is, data is all sensitive if it identifies us. Right? And the ability of companies to buy up other data and merge it with data they got from another source means that even if something looked like it was sensitive at one point, it can be merged with things that weren't sensitive, and suddenly you've got more sensitive data. Or you take two insensitive pieces of data. They're not financial information, they're not medical information, and you put them together and suddenly they identify you, which makes other sensitive information. So this idea of doubling down on sensitive versus insensitive just doesn't make any sense in a world of ubiquitous data, right? So the FTC structure has been false for a long time and doesn't really represent consumers' best interests in that respect. And the idea that we're going to go ahead and propel it forward doesn't make any more sense. So what we need to do is think about what the future looks like. Companies are buying each other. They are sharing data across affiliates. Many times consumers want that information to travel from one trusted company to another, or they want to block it at some point. But this rule that the FCC has put out doesn't give them any more modicum of control about that handoff in these large companies, right? There's no sense of additional control that consumers are actually going to take away from this. Maybe there's another cop on the beat. Great. I love it. But where does the consumer actually understand what's happening, and how do they exercise control? And this rule fails to give them the sense of control that I think Harold and Richard both are talking about, them consumers wanting.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to see. The technology evolves so quickly that it's hard to see how regulators can either can manage with a law that, particularly the telecom law that was passed before we had the internet. So, Harold, I want to ask you if, assuming that I think the FCC is doing the best that it can given new technologies that the statutes are way behind in terms of catching up to, is there a danger to only regulating one piece of this broader communications network because that's the only place they have authority for, and leaving the edge providers to a different cop?
I actually believe that there is wisdom in, and again, it's not just the FCC. We have a number of agencies that do this, including on the privacy question. And I do think that there is wisdom in maintaining what have been traditional and natural places where specialized knowledge is important. I think that, the fact is that communications networks, there are good features about this. They're actually written into 222, the relevant law, which talks about uses that the company can make of the information without being asked, because we recognize that, you want to use these in the beneficial ways. I have, on the other hand, said you can't just say to companies don't collect this information, because, if you want companies to do things like anticipate demand and know, and rationally manage their networks, they need to do things like collect the data on, when are the networks most being used, what is the nature of the traffic. That's why there's an aggregate data exception in there. So, I first of all do think that, look, a lot of people who assume that just because something is old doesn't mean, means that it must be out of date. First Amendment is 225 years old, and we still think it's pretty important. Hell, 10 Commandments go back a lot further, and I still think they're pretty important. But, the issue, I think, is, first of all, understand that when you try to future-proof stuff, that of necessity means leaving flexibility to the agency. So there's a balance. Congress needs to give, proper direction and oversight, and at the same time leave flexibility to the agency to handle new things. But with regard to the specific question, I think that certainly we ought to re-examine, our attitudes and the current regime surrounding web-based services, particularly also Internet of Things, because nobody expects that your lamp is collecting information about you. Nobody expects that your TV is listening to what goes on, in your bedroom where you have it. We'll pause to let that sink in for a minute if
Thank you for that terrifying thought.
But, my point is that we are indeed in a brave new world, one in which it's not just a question of being creeped out, but a question of, fundamental values about our society and what we think is important and not important. And those do need to be rethought. But part of the way we collect on that is to have agencies that have authority to do things like rulemaking, have them go out and do their jobs. And then Congress looks at the results. We collectively, in the political system and society, look at the results, and we try to figure out, the question that Tim has raised, what does make sense?
So I think we have to vacate this room in a few minutes. I would love if there's people out there who want to ask questions to the panel. I mean, obviously these guys know this really well. So I could keep going, but I bet you guys have some questions. Anybody? Yeah.
Hard to know where to start here. Many things that missed today, but perhaps just take the last one. This idea is just often to me. This idea that all laws, the bad laws, the age of
So I hear two questions in your question. So I think the two questions that I hear are, one, is the FCC going to divert from the FTC's model in terms of what it's going to do? And maybe Harold could answer that question. And the second question, which I want Tim to address, is the rigidity of the law and how rigid is particularly the Telecom Act that we're dealing with. But Harold, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, look, we start with a very different statute. We start with Section 222, in which Congress identified certain things as being covered. We can argue about whether the statute also gives a general catch-all authority of, sort of any confidential information. That's a statutory interpretation question. But certainly, even if we're going to adopt the most rigid reading of the statute, there is a category of stuff that Congress singled out as being either the most competitively sensitive or the most personally sensitive, depending on which you think was the major point of the statute. The FCC has a different set of things that it's supposed to be balancing. It's got to balance not just the personal privacy issue, but under the same statute, the competition issue, and how that weighs out, including not just the positive, we'll have more competition in the online advertising market, but potential negatives like, do I get to look at other streaming services and identify patterns that viewers have looking at other streaming services so that I can build a better rival streaming service. Congress has made a bunch of choices around that, which the FCC is bound to respect. I think that one of the, I actually do not agree with adopting the FTC's sensitive, non-sensitive. I and a number of my colleagues have written against it precisely because it is not what the statute calls for in this case. So I would actually hope, it's the industry that has urged adopting the FTC's sensitive, non-sensitive standard. We've argued very strongly against that. I've argued, public knowledge has argued that when it comes to communications, all information is inherently sensitive because you have to assume that sensitive information is going to be traveling over the network, and the only way to know the difference is by looking. So, which we don't want you to do. So I happen to think that you're right. We should not simply, or let me put it another way, I don't think that the statute permits a standards-based approach, and I think the statute is Congress's judgment that certain types of information are uniquely sensitive in the communications situation, and that's what the FCC should be doing, is following the statute.
Technology always outstrips the ability of law to constrain it. And we have to understand that as people who are engaged in the public policy discourse. And so any standards-based law that doesn't produce maximal flexibility when it's seeking to regulate technology is doomed to failure. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 is utterly anachronistic. It needs to be thrown out and rewritten completely. Again, based on the understanding that what we're talking about is data, irrespective of the industry that's gathering it. We probably need to do over on that too. And so doubling down on industry-based regulation in the communication space, which is merging quickly with the internet and app space, just doesn't make sense. We need a future-proofed system. And so therefore this FCC rule, it really should be withdrawn and rewritten. And it may not be that the FTC's catch-all approach is going to be the best approach at the end of the day, but this FCC approach doesn't understand the way the technology and industry are working today. And it leaves a gap both for consumers and entrepreneurs. And I think that's the last point that we really haven't made. I represent not only a bunch of privacy advocacy organizations and civil liberty advocacy organizations, I represent a bunch of small upstart edge providers. Some of them provide communication services, and then they also provide internet services. And it's really hard to tell them that the moment the data passes from one of your databases to another, it gets an entirely different protection regime. One's going to be like this and one's going to be like that. And if it goes back the other way, it goes like this. It just doesn't make a bit of sense. So let's do better.
Yeah, I mean, I can convert sensitive data to non-sensitive data simply by de-identifying it. Because it's not really the nature, it's the connection with the individual is where the sensitivity comes into it. And while it's easy to sort of point out all the flaws in the law, that shouldn't keep us from noticing the flaws in the FCC's NPRM. I mean, for example, there is just a blatant technical falsehood in the NPRM in the sense that it makes the presumption that aggregation is the only effective form of de-identification. And I mean, you have to be fairly deep in the weeds on the technology to understand why that's the case. But to me, the issues that are of the most importance don't relate to the status of the firm that collects the information. It's about the sharing of the information and under what terms and conditions can data transactions take place, because they're critical to so many aspects of the economy and of science and technology development. So and those are not industry specific. You don't have to own a network to be in the communications business anymore. Facebook, what they're doing is communications. They're facilitating communications. What Google does when you do a search and you find a bunch of sites and you click on some links, Google has facilitated that communication. So they don't own the underlying network, but you know the nature of networks is evolving to the point that they're mainly software entities anyway. Software defined networks are a current reality, and they're even more so the reality of the future of networking. So this traditional distinction that we've always been able to make between content and speakers on the one hand and communication networks on the other, it's just not a technical reality. The technologies involved in both above the line and below the line of content and communications are the same. The activities are the same. The software is pretty much the same. So, we're really trying to make status distinctions across a set of behaviors that are actually the same behavior, just done in slightly different ways, with the same consequences for consumers.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for exploring this giant mess that we find ourselves in. Thanks a lot. I think we're all done. So unless you guys want to come up and talk.
In some of this stuff, I do think there are still relevant distinctions. I still need physical facilities in order to reach whoever I'm going to reach. But even there, we have a tradition of saying, look, if you're reselling capacity, I've always been in favor of saying, look, if you're really, if you're facilitating communication directly, no matter you're talking about, as a VoIP provider or some kind of OTT messaging service, then yes, you should be a telecommunications provider. And the distinction of the